Now, let me now turn to the causes of the crisis and whether we have taken action to address some of the persistent and repeating causes of the multiple crises we've had. And that's reflected in the 17 IMF programs that we have undertaken over the years. So I think all of you probably have heard me say this before, which is that I think that macroeconomic stress has been the main cause of the reason why we've gone from being second to Japan in Asia in 1948 to where we are today. And the primary underlying cause is the government's fiscal operations. Excess demand pumped into the system by large budget deficits. And clearly that fuels inflation, and some of that excess demand leaks into imports and puts pressure on the balance of payments and eventually the currency. And the impact of excess or unsustainable budget deficits has been amplified in our case by fiscal dominance in monetary policy. The central bank has done deficit financing by participating in the primary auctions. It has undertaken financial repression by artificially suppressing interest rates. All this augments the excess aggregate demand pumped into the system by the budget. Then you have monetary policy pumping in even more excess demand. And of course, the balance of payments crisis, the balance of payments imbalances, which result, then put pressure on the currency. And we tend to try to hold the currency by depleting our reserves. So this is the cycle, repeated cycle in terms of a playbook. This is what we've done again and again. If you look backwards, it happened in 2019. It happened in 2015. Each time a government changes, we don't do structural reforms and get our growth trajectory elevated by strengthening the growth framework. Instead, what happens is politicians start getting impatient because these successive IMF programs are designed to compress domestic absorption. Domestic absorption defined as consumption plus investment. The whole idea is to compress it. So growth comes down, and we don't do the structural reforms because they're difficult. They take a long time, and there are winners and losers. And though there are many more winners than there are losers, the losers have a louder voice and stronger political connections. So we don't do the structural reforms, and the politicians get impatient, and they then have an artificial boom created by unsustainable macro policies of the nature that I've just described. So this has been a repeating cycle. And as I keep saying, Einstein's definition of insanity is to do the same thing again and again and to expect different outcomes. So clearly, we need to wean ourselves away from that particular playbook. So let me now turn to whether or not we have done enough to wean ourselves away from that playbook. And here there are two things that we need, which I think are the key pillars. And one is the Central Bank Act, and the second is the Public Finance Management Bill. It is still a bill. I think it's with the AG's department. Hopefully it will come to Parliament soon and it will be passed. So how do those pieces of legislation address this repeating causality of macro stress that I've just described? So let me start with the Public Finance Management Bill. As you know, since, I think, 1954, if you count last year, I think we've only had 5 years when there's been a primary surplus in the budget, right? As you all know, if you have a primary deficit, what you're really doing is you're not meeting the current year's expenditure with current year's revenue, excluding interest. When that happens, you are inevitably leads to increase in the debt stock. You're borrowing additionally to meet the current year's expenditure. So we've only had 5 years since 54 where we've had a surplus. So I'm pretty sure, I haven't seen the Public Finance Management Bill, but I'm sure at the heart of it will be the commitment to have a primary surplus in the budget year after year after year. That is the only way we can begin to reduce the debt stock, which is even after the debt restructuring, it is going to be a major overhang. Because if you see the DSA, we see the debt as a percent of GDP, even if we do everything correctly, we get to 2032 with a debt to GDP ratio of 95%. Now the norm for market access countries like ours is about 70. So that is the kind of vulnerability we would still have even if we do everything well. So it's critical that we stay on track. One way of actually pushing things in our favor is to have growth above the 3% that is built into the IMF's DSA. So that is critical, and I think it's doable. I'll talk a bit about it later, but that is doable, and that's what we need to do to drive growth so that it goes above that 3% that's built into the DSA. So that's the Public Finance Management Bill, which I hope will tackle this inherent weakness in the government's budgetary policies, which has been at the heart of the macroeconomic stress, which in my view has been the major cause of our regression from being the second best economy in Asia in 1948. Then, if I can turn to the Central Bank Act, as you know, it now prevents or prohibits the central bank from participating in the primary auctions for treasury bills. That is the most egregious form of money printing. That is the way the government gets its deficit financed, or the most important and most destructive way the government gets its deficit financed. You know, one of the biggest regrets I have, almost in my life, I think, it's not just in terms of my official work, is not getting the Central Bank Act through Parliament before December 2019. We got it to Parliament, but we ran out of time, parliamentary time. Because if that was in place, if the Central Bank Act was passed by December 2019, I don't think anybody would have effected those tax cuts. Because there's no way you would be able to finance the government's operation. You would not have been able to pay salaries and meet any of the other priority commitments of the government if the central bank was not there with massive amounts of money printing. So that's a great shame. We couldn't get it done, and perhaps we could have avoided going down that route of having unsustainable tax cuts in 2019. So that, in addition also, the adoption of a flexible inflation targeting framework, which is now embedded in the Central Bank Act. Because what that does is really sets out monetary policy formulation based on a data-driven, forward-looking basis, and no longer can one kind of mess around in a political way by shoving interest rates up and down. Because what is built into the law is this flexible inflation targeting regime, which, as I said, is data-driven, forward-looking, and deviating from that would be a breach of the law now. So the whims and fancies of politicians or anybody who is politically oriented to shove interest rates here and there would not be possible. You would have to now do it in this technical way. The law prescribes that you do so. So that again is a major change. And of course there are changes to the governance structure, like the Treasury is no longer represented in the two governance structures of the central bank, and there's a macroprudential authority set up, a number of very good things, but in the interest of time I'm not going to go into it. But again, so we are attacking these two crucial ways in which we've had these repeated macroeconomic crises. One is the Public Finance Management Bill, prescribing that we have to have a primary surplus in the budget. And the second is the central bank being prevented from, one, deficit financing, and two, artificially manipulating interest rates. So that, I think, so in that way, I feel that the causes of for me, what are the main causes of this repeating macro crisis, which has held us back, have been addressed. And so these are the two key pillars, the Public Finance Management Bill and the Central Bank Act. And we need to make sure that these stay in place. I don't think the people who legislated the Central Bank Act were fully aware of what's happening. The whole intention of these bits of legislation is to tie people's hands so that they don't have excesses in terms of macroeconomic management. And I don't think people like it. We're not used to the hands of our politicians being tied. So you will see a big reaction, particularly as it dawns on them what has happened, because possibly they haven't fully understood what has been done. But the whole point is to tie their hands. And so, you see people saying that the Parliament's authority is not being, has been undermined. Well, actually, that's what countries around the world have done. They've tied the hands of the politicians when it comes to monetary policy. So I think we need to learn that, and I hope this law is protected by all of you. You can't count on the politicians protecting it. As I said at the previous forum, turkeys don't usually vote for Christmas. So you have to protect it. Everybody in this country needs to protect the Central Bank Act and to make sure that the fiscal operations give us a primary surplus. Because you've seen the consequences of not doing that. People haven't really been interested in macroeconomic policy making. They've left it to the politicians and the central bank and the treasury, etc. That's not good enough. I think we all have to get interested and make sure that these kind of mistakes are not made, because we made it so many times. You can't make it again. So let me make a special plea that people in this room, as somebody said, accounting for a very large share of the GDP in the country, you have the countervailing authority to push back when things are obviously going wrong.